Was Jesus of Nazareth a real person? I mean, it's one of history's biggest, most debated questions. So today, we're going to dive into the scholarly sources, break down the actual evidence for his existence, look at the counterclaims, and see what methods historians use to even try and find the answer.
Okay, let's just jump right in. The central question sounds simple, but wow, the answer is anything but. Was Jesus a real historical person or a figure of myth? And look, this isn't about faith. This is about historical detective work. And to really get the debate, we first have to understand the opposing view.
So, this view has a name. It's called Mythicism. Proponents, like the scholar Richard Carrier, argue that Jesus actually started out as a kind of cosmic celestial being in the earliest Christian beliefs, and only later, in texts like the Gospels, was he given a human backstory. So the big question is, what does our earliest evidence actually say? To find out, historians go straight to the oldest Christian writings we have, the undisputed letters of the Apostle Paul. I mean, these were written just a couple of decades after Jesus' supposed death. They're older than the Gospels, and they give us our very first glimpse into this new movement.
Now, the mythicist argument really hinges on this one idea, that Paul's Christ is a purely spiritual savior, someone revealed only in visions with absolutely no connection to a real life on earth. But the source material we're looking at argues that if you take a closer look at Paul's own words, a very different picture starts to emerge.
So this really breaks down the core disagreement. Mythicists might read a phrase like born of a woman and say it's just a metaphor. But our source points out that this was a pretty common way of saying someone had a normal human birth. And then there's this line where Paul says Jesus was descended from David according to the flesh. He uses the Greek katasarka, and scholars argue this isn't vague at all. It explicitly means biological lineage, which would have been a super important detail for his Jewish audience.
And then there's this other fascinating little detail. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul casually mentions meeting a guy named James, who he calls the brother of the Lord. And this one reference, it becomes a huge point of contention. Okay, so here's the crucial bit. Paul calls lots of fellow Christians brothers in his letters, but he only ever uses this very specific formal title, ho adelphos tou kurio, for this one man, James. The source argues this isn't just a generic hey brother kind of thing, it's a unique identifier. It suggests a real family relationship that gave James some serious authority in the early church.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because external evidence pops up. Decades later, the non-Christian Jewish historian Josephus also writes about a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ. Suddenly, you have two independent sources using the exact same, very specific identifier. For historians, that kind of convergence is a really big deal.
All right, let's shift gears to the absolute center of the Christian story, the crucifixion. The mythicist view proposes that this, too, wasn't something that happened here on earth.
So the theory goes that when Paul wrote that Jesus was crucified by the rulers of this age, he meant demonic spirits, up in the lower heavens. But the source material pushes back, arguing that Paul uses that same exact word for rulers, archontes, in other places to talk about Roman officials. And more importantly, crucifixion wasn't some abstract celestial idea. It was a brutal, very public, and exclusively Roman method of execution.
This leads historians to a really cool principle called the criterion of embarrassment. The argument goes like this. You're probably not going to invent a detail that is humiliating or works against your own cause. And for first-century Jews, a crucified Messiah was, frankly, a contradiction, a total failure. The fact that this incredibly shameful death is at the very core of the story suggests it was a historical reality they had to explain, not some fiction they just decided to make up.
So far, we've been focused mostly on Christian texts. But what did outsiders have to say? This is where the case moves beyond an internal debate and gets really compelling. This timeline really helps put all the sources into perspective. You have the crucifixion around 30 CE. Just 20 years later, that's within a generation, Paul is writing. But then, as we get to the end of the first century and into the second, we start getting these crucial references from non-Christian, Jewish, and Roman historians.
And here are the heavy hitters. We've already seen Josephus, but then you get the Roman historian Tacitus, who, while writing about the Emperor Nero, just flat out states that Christus, the founder of this Christian movement, was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. He anchors this person and this event firmly in Roman history. Even early Christian arguments like Ignatius pleading with people not to deny Jesus came in the flesh show that the mainstream belief was always in an earthly physical person.
Okay, so the final area our source dives into isn't just about the evidence itself, but the very method we use to interpret that evidence. This is where it gets a little philosophical.
A pretty common mythicist argument is that Jesus' life story neatly fits a kind of checklist of traits that are common to mythical heroes like Oedipus or Hercules. It's known as the Rank-Raglan hero pattern. The idea is, hey, if he fits the pattern, he's probably a myth.
But the source here argues this comparison is really flawed. If you look at our absolute earliest evidence, Paul's letters, Jesus scores incredibly low on this mythic hero scale. We're talking maybe 4 or 5 points out of a possible 22. That score only starts to climb with the later Gospels. Meanwhile, archetypal heroes like Oedipus, they score off the charts. So the source levels a few key methodological critiques. First, it says that some of the statistical arguments for mythicism depend on probabilities that are really subjective. Second, it points to a kind of selective skepticism, dismissing a solid historian like Tacitus, while at the same time inventing a pre-Christian archangel named Jesus that has zero textual evidence. And finally, it argues that these myth patterns often have to be stretched pretty thin to make Jesus fit the mold. So ultimately, the source concludes that while the mythicist position presents a radical and interesting challenge, it just doesn't manage to overturn the consensus that's held by the vast majority of critical historians, whether they're secular or religious.
And this quote really sums up that consensus view. The simplest explanation, the one that best accounts for all the evidence we have, from Paul, from the Roman and Jewish writers, is that Jesus of Nazareth was a real, first-century Jewish teacher who was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And all of this leaves us with a final, really important question to think about. When we evaluate any historical claim, how do we navigate that very fine line between applying healthy, necessary skepticism to our sources and rejecting solid evidence to the point of denial? It's a question that really gets to the very heart of how we do history.
Okay, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are wading into, one of the most intellectually stimulating and often fiercely debated areas of historical inquiry. We're talking about the question of Jesus' historicity. The deep dive today is focused on a stack of sources that challenge a really fundamental assumption, regarding the origins of Christianity. The assertion that Jesus of Nazareth never existed as a historical person. The specific view we're analyzing is called mythicism. It's a position popularized most notably by scholars like Richard Carrier. His core argument, essentially, is that the figure of Jesus originated not as a man, but as a celestial being, kind of pre-existing archangel, perhaps. And this being, according to the theory, atoned for sins in some cosmic realm and was only later historicized, given earthly attributes by early believers as the stories developed. You see this perspective gaining, remarkable traction online. It's often presented through channels like the Godless Engineer YouTube program, positioning itself as the rational, skeptical challenge to centuries of traditional scholarship. Our mission today isn't about debating theology, not at all.
We want to look purely at the historical evidence. We want to provide you with a kind of shortcut to understanding why the overwhelming mainstream consensus that Jesus did exist as a first-century Jewish man remains the most plausible historical conclusion. So we'll be meticulously examining the core evidence from Paul, from Josephus, Tacitus, and critically laying out the methodological critiques that get leveled against the mythicist approach itself.
That's absolutely essential, because we really need to set the historical baseline right away. The scholarly consensus on this is remarkably firm, and it crosses denominational lines. You have major figures across the spectrum supporting it, from, say, skeptics like Bart Ehrman to prominent New Testament specialists like E.P. Sanders. The consensus holds that Jesus existed, he was a Jewish teacher, and crucially, he was executed under Pontius Pilate. Now, Carrier's theoretical model, which he details in his books on the historicity of Jesus and proving history, it relies heavily on some very specific technical methods. Primarily, he uses Bayesian reasoning, which is a complex mathematical model for calculating probability, and he also does extensive myth-type comparisons, trying to fit Jesus into these established hero patterns from antiquity. But what we are going to show you today, really, is that for mythicism to work, it requires some highly speculative reconstructions. It demands that we accept these forced, frankly, non-obvious reinterpretations of pretty straightforward textual evidence. Ultimately, it just fails to meet the stringent requirements of historical scrutiny when you measure it against the weight and, well, the economy of the sources we actually possess.
Okay, so let's unpack this. And we have to start where all good historical inquiries into Christianity must start. The undisputed letters of the Apostle Paul. These were written decades, remember, before the Gospels were compiled. The mythicist claim here is quite elegant, in a way. They argue Paul's Christ is purely a cosmic savior, someone revealed only in private visions. So the implication is Paul didn't believe Jesus had actually, walked the earth.
Right. But this is where the mythicist interpretation immediately starts to, well, strain the texts themselves. When you actually scrutinize Paul's own words, the sources repeatedly affirm Jesus' humanity and his connection to the world in very concrete terms.
Yeah, it seems quite direct in places.
It does. We have at least two key references in Paul that seem, frankly, impossible to square with a purely celestial being. Let's consider key text 1. This is from Galatians 4:4. Paul writes that Christ was born of a woman, born under the law.
Born of a woman, born under the law. Okay.
Scholar Simon Gathercole points out that this phrase, it just presupposes an ordinary biological human birth. It's not poetic language for something abstract. It's a statement about biology. He came out of a woman, and it's a statement of identity. He was under the law. Now, what does under the law mean? It means he was circumcised, he lived, he operated within the legal and social framework of first century Judaism. That's a very specific context.
So if Paul meant this just metaphorically, like maybe born of a woman just means born into the abstract state of humanity, why would he then add that very specific, almost legalistic identifier, born under the law? That seems redundant if it's just metaphor.
Exactly. The phrase under the law is incredibly specific to the covenantal relationship of Jews. A celestial being isn't under the law. Angels don't follow Mosaic law. Gathercole argues, quite convincingly I think, that reading this metaphorically, which mythicists have to do, imposes this unnecessary and frankly convoluted layer of complexity onto what seems, in its original context, like a straightforward claim about lineage and status. It really violates the basic principle of reading texts in their most immediate and obvious historical context. You have to twist it quite hard.
Okay, and then there's the second one, key text 2. This is in Romans 1.3. Here, Jesus is explicitly identified as descended from David according to the flesh.
Yes, and this one is perhaps even more explicit, even more physical. The scholar Daniel Galata emphasizes that the phrase kata sarka, which we translate as according to the flesh, explicitly refers to biological or genealogical lineage. For Paul's audience, especially his Jewish readers, Davidic descent wasn't some vague spiritual concept. It was deeply political. It was highly specific. It was a genealogical requirement for the expected Messiah.
Right. You couldn't have a celestial Davidic line. I mean, that concept just wasn't floating around in Second Temple Jewish thought, was it?
Precisely. It makes no sense. Paul uses that specific phrase, kata sarka, to situate Jesus within a known earthy family tree. It anchors him politically and genetically to a specific royal line on earth. So if Paul only knew Jesus from visions, why on earth would he immediately ground him in the most human, political, and genealogical way possible? He wouldn't be interested in the fleshly lineage of a purely cosmic being. It's counterintuitive.
Now, I know a common mythicist response to these two very explicit statements of the birth, the lineage, is to claim, well, they must be later interpolations, that maybe later Christians, the ones started to write the Gospels perhaps, inserted them to historicize Jesus.
Yes, that's a necessary move for the mythicist argument, absolutely. But it's a move that really falls flat when you look at the actual evidence. Bart Ehrman points this out very clearly. Historical certainty requires manuscript support. You need evidence in the manuscript tradition. And in this case, there is absolutely zero manuscript evidence, none whatsoever, that omits phrases like born of a woman or descended from David. These texts are incredibly stable from the earliest manuscript copies we possess.
So if there were later editions, you'd expect to find at least some early copies without them.
You absolutely would. That's how textual criticism works. The complete lack of such variants makes the interpolation argument extremely weak. It's basically an argument from silence and against the existing evidence.
I think what really stands out, though, is the assumption Paul seems to be making. He doesn't spend any time laying out a biography of Jesus. Why not, if he's introducing this figure?
That's a great point. He doesn't because he assumes his audience already knows the basic facts. As Galata summarizes it, Paul is writing letters to already existing Christian communities. Communities like the one in Rome, which he didn't even found, or communities he was correcting, like the Corinthians. He assumes the recipients already understand the basic story, Jesus' human origin, his life, his very public execution. Paul's letters are primarily about theology, what Jesus' life and death mean, not about basic biography that he lived and died. That seems to be common knowledge for his readers.
So the mythicist position essentially forces us to treat Paul's clear, stable language about birth, flesh, law, lineage, as some kind of code for something entirely different, just to make the thesis hold up.
Yes, it requires a kind of interpretive gymnastics that doesn't seem warranted by the text itself.
Okay, this is where the argument, I think, gets even more specific. It shifts from these general statements about humanity and lineage to a highly specific, historically identifiable individual, someone who was actually Paul's contemporary, James. We know from Paul's own letters, specifically Galatians, that Paul traveled to Jerusalem and met James, and he explicitly refers to him in Galatians 1:19 as James, the brother of the Lord. Now, Carrier and other mythicists contend this phrase, brother of the Lord, is purely metaphorical. It just means a fellow spiritual believer, a brother in the faith, not a biological brother.
Right. But that interpretation immediately runs into a significant problem, both linguistically and structurally, within Paul's own writing style. Paul frequently uses the general term adelphoi, which means brothers, for Christians generally. Sometimes he uses it dozens of times in a single letter, just referring to the whole community. But, and this is the key point, he reserves the unique, highly specific title ho adelphos to Kyrio, literally the brother of the Lord, exclusively for this specific individual, James.
That distinction really is crucial, isn't it? Using the definite articles, the brother of the Lord. It's not just a brother, it's the brother. It's not a generic designation. It feels like a distinctive marker, maybe of kinship, setting him apart.
Exactly. It functions like a specific title. And look where Paul places James. Immediately after mentioning meeting Peter, Cephas, he lists James alongside Cephas and John as the pillars of the church in Jerusalem in Galatians 2:9. This placement emphasizes James's singular authority within that crucial Jerusalem community. And logically, you have to ask, where does that authority come from? It seems most likely it derives, at least in part, from his intimate, familial relationship with the movement's founder.
It gives him a unique standing.
It does. If James was just another believer, Paul likely would have just called him an adelphos, like everyone else. But he uses hu adelphos to Kyrio. The uniqueness of that specific title points strongly towards a singular status derived from, well, biology.
Now, I think the real weight of the evidence here comes when we use our historical toolbox, like you said earlier, and look for independent external convergence. We shouldn't just rely on Paul. Right?
Absolutely not. And this is where we bring in Josephus. Flavius Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, writing decades after Paul penned Galatians. He independently describes the death of someone named James. And how does he identify this James? In his work, Antiquities of the Jews, Book 20, Section 200, he calls him James, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ.
Okay, wait a minute. That reference seems almost too perfect. How do we know that specific line about James being the brother of Jesus who is called Christ isn't maybe a later Christian forgery inserted into Josephus to bolster their claims, especially since there's debate about another Josephus passage about Jesus?
That's a very important question. Scholars have scrutinized this passage, the one about James, incredibly intensively. And while there is significant debate about that other passage, the Testimonium Flavianum, which seems to describe Jesus more broadly, this specific reference to James in Antiquities 20 is largely accepted by the vast majority of critical scholars, including Jewish scholars and secular scholars, as authentic, perhaps with some very minor Christian polishing like adding who is called Christ, but the core reference to James as the brother of Jesus is considered solid.
And why is there such consensus on this passage compared to the other one?
A few reasons. Firstly, the context. Josephus describes James's execution. He was stoned as an illegal act carried out by the high priest Ananus during an interregnum between Roman governors. This whole narrative fits perfectly within the known historical context of political and religious turmoil in Judea around 62 CE. It doesn't feel like a pious insertion, it feels like political history. Secondly, Josephus doesn't actually praise Jesus here. He just uses Jesus, who is called Christ, as an identifier for James. The focus is entirely on James and the illegality of his death, which caused problems for Ananias.
Okay, so the significance of the convergence then seems pretty undeniable, regardless of any minor debates around the exact phrasing.
Precisely. What you have is Paul, writing probably in the 50s CE, using this unique familial phrase, holodophos tu Kyriou, to identify James. Then, completely independently, you have Josephus, a non-Christian Jewish historian writing in the 90s CE, using the exact same type of familial identification, the brother of Jesus who is called Christ, to refer to the very same figure. The mythicist reading requires us to believe, first, that Paul singled out just one believer metaphorically with this unique brother title for reasons unknown. And then, completely coincidentally, Josephus, writing independently decades later, just happened to use the exact same unique phrasing to identify the sibling of the same central figure, Jesus. That chain of coincidences is so statistically improbable, it really stretches historical credulity past the breaking point.
So the fire of James himself becomes this enormous obstacle for mythicism. His established prominence in Jerusalem, attested by both Paul and Josephus, it really proves that early Christianity centered not on some purely celestial figure existing only in visions, but on a real man whose actual biological family remained central to the leadership and administration of the early church right there in Jerusalem, even after his physical death. The focus was still very much earthbound, connected to real people and real family ties.
It anchors the movement in a very concrete human reality.
Okay, let's move on to the ultimate event in the traditional story, the execution. The mythicist claim here is arguably the most radical of all. Carrier argues that Jesus wasn't crucified on earth by the Romans at all. Instead, he proposes Jesus was crucified in a heavenly realm, maybe by demonic powers. And this interpretation relies almost entirely on one verse in Paul, 1 Corinthians 2:8. That's where Paul says that the rulers of this age, the Greek is archontes to ionos to two, crucified the Lord of glory. Mythicists argue these rulers must be demons or cosmic forces, not earthly rulers.
Right, and this is really a classic example of potentially removing a text from its broader cultural and literary context. We absolutely have to place that specific phrase, archontes tu ionos to two, within Paul's overall worldview. And if you look elsewhere in Paul's writings, for instance in Romans 13, verses 1 through 3, Paul uses the same word, archontes, to describe earthly governing authorities. There, it's a clear, straightforward reference to Roman officials, the ones who wield the sword and collect taxes.
So the word archontes itself definitely can mean Roman governors and officials in Paul's usage.
Absolutely, unequivocally. Now, here's where the nuance comes in, and it's important. Gallot explains that in the first century Jewish worldview, there wasn't always a sharp distinction between the earthly and the cosmic. Human rulers were often understood to be influenced by, or even acting as agents or puppets of, spiritual or demonic forces. Think of the powers behind the throne being cosmic, but the people actually holding the sword and giving the orders were still human.
Ah, I see. So the idea of spiritual influence wasn't necessarily mutually exclusive with actual political earthly authority. Both could be true at once.
Correct. Paul's worldview easily allowed both dimensions to operate simultaneously. He could very well mean the Roman ruler's Pilate, perhaps the collaborating high priests who were the earthly agents or manifestations of these cosmic forces of evil this age. To force a complete separation, to insist that the archontes in 1 Corinthians must be only heavenly demons and never earthly rulers, that's arguably anachronistic. It imposes a modern, sharp separation that might not fit the integrated Jewish understanding of how power worked in the world.
Okay, but let's play devil's advocate for a second. Even if Paul could mean earthly rulers, why is the alternative idea, a purely heavenly crucifixion, considered so implausible by most historians?
Well, mainly because of the stark cultural reality of the practice itself. Crucifixion wasn't some generic symbolic death. It was a very specific, incredibly brutal form of Roman capital punishment. It was tied explicitly to things like political rebellion, slave uprisings, and extreme public shame. Gathercole notes that Jews in the first century simply did not imagine executions of this particular kind taking place in the heavens. Angels might battle, they might fall from grace, but they weren't thought to be nailed to celestial crosses by demons. It just doesn't fit the known symbolic world.
And the entire historical record we have, outside of that one potentially ambiguous phrase in Paul, points overwhelmingly toward a public, earthly, and deeply shameful death.
Right. It absolutely does. Even non-Christian writers who were hostile to the faith think of the 2nd century satirical writer Lucian of Samosata, or the pagan philosopher Celsus. What did they ridicule Christians for? They mocked them precisely because they worshipped a crucified man. Not a spirit executed in the heavens, but a human being who suffered a degrading Roman execution. If the original Christian belief had been in some cosmic death drama, you can bet their enemies would have mocked that mythology.
But they didn't. They mocked the physical shame of the cross.
Exactly. Which confirms that the common understanding of the event, even among Christianity's detractors, was rooted in a real, historical, public execution.
And of course, this brings us back to that really powerful piece of external confirmation, this time from the Roman side.
Tacitus. Cornelius Tacitus, arguably the greatest Roman historian. Writing around 116 CE in his Annals, he was describing the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE and how Emperor Nero needed scapegoats. Tacitus, it's crucial to remember, was no friend to Christians. He referred to their faith as a mischievous superstition, a deadly disease. He clearly despised them.
Which is important, because it means he had absolutely no vested interest in supporting their foundational claims about Jesus. He wasn't trying to help them.
Not in the slightest, and yet what did this hostile witness record? He explicitly states, when explaining who these Christians were, that Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate.
Wow, that's incredibly specific.
It is. You have a Roman source confirming a Roman form of execution, extreme penalty, which for non-citizens often meant crucifixion, under a specific named Roman official Pontius Pilate during a specific historical period, the reign of Emperor Tiberius, 14 to 37 CE. This historical anchoring, which Tacitus likely derived either from Roman provincial records or just common public knowledge in Rome about this troublesome sect, confirms the execution as a verifiable historical act within the Roman system.
It seems almost impossible for Tacitus to somehow anchor a purely celestial myth about a cosmic being to a specific, real Roman procurator like Pilate. The concepts just seem mutually exclusive.
They really do. And this leads us directly to a very important principle in historical Jesus studies, the criterion of embarrassment. As scholars like E.P. Sanders and many others have argued, the crucifixion was arguably the single most unlikely event that early Christians would simply invent out of whole cloth. Why? Because it completely shattered Jewish messianic expectations. The expected Messiah was supposed to be a triumphant figure, someone who would conquer Rome, restore Israel's glory, maybe even usher in God's kingdom on earth. Not someone who would be arrested, condemned, and executed by Rome in the most humiliating public way imaginable, a death reserved for slaves and rebels.
But hang on, couldn't you argue the opposite? Couldn't early Christians have invented the crucifixion precisely because it was so shocking? To contrast it with the traditional triumphant Jewish Messiah narrative, didn't the very shame of the death then make the subsequent claim of resurrection even more powerful, more paradoxical?
That's a really great question, and it definitely speaks to the necessary tension in the historical reality. They absolutely needed a death, a real painful death, to make sense of the resurrection claim, yes. But the question is, why invent this specific form of death? The most politically disastrous, theologically scandalous form of death imaginable for a potential Jewish Messiah. Paul himself calls the cross a scandalon, a scandal, a stumbling block, especially for Jews. According to Deuteronomy, anyone hung on a tree was considered cursed by God. If you were inventing a foundational story for a new religious movement aimed initially at fellow Jews, why would you invent a death that immediately signified your founder was cursed by God and a political failure in the eyes of Rome?
It seems counterproductive if you're trying to attract followers.
Deeply counterproductive. You'd invent maybe a glorious death in battle or perhaps a quiet death in sleep followed by an ascension. You wouldn't invent a state execution that publicly confirmed your founder was viewed by the authorities as a common criminal or a political threat.
So the argument is that this difficult, shameful fact is precisely what most demands historical grounding. It's too problematic to have been invented. The fact of the crucifixion, as the sources strongly suggest, is, as some scholars put it, as sure as anything historical can ever be.
Pretty much. And to claim this core event was merely a cosmic drama requires denying perhaps the single most historically certain fact about the foundation of the entire Christian movement. It's a very high bar to clear. #Tag4V. Critiquing the heavenly Jesus archangel hypothesis.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly and move now to what is really the philosophical and, well, the historical centerpiece of Carrier's specific mythicist model. This is the idea that the celestial being involved actually had the name Jesus before the rise of Christianity. The idea is that this being was envisioned perhaps as an archangel, who then somehow atoned for sin through cosmic death, and this specific named being was only later historicized, given an earthly biography.
Right. And this is where I think the argument shifts significantly. We move away from simply reinterpreting existing texts, like Paul's letters, towards essentially inventing new entities or concepts that lack clear grounding in the historical record. This specific hypothesis, a pre-Christian archangel named Jesus who dies cosmically, it really lacks even minimal textual foundations in the vast body of existing Jewish literature from that period.
Let's start with the problem of the name itself. The name Jesus, or Yeshua in Hebrew Aramaic, is actually part of the problem for this theory, isn't it?
It really is. Daniel Galata, again, demonstrates this quite clearly. If you look at Jewish angelology, the study of angels in Jewish texts, the names overwhelmingly, almost universally, end with the theophoric suffix El. That El signifies God. So you think of the famous archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Uriel, Raphael. These names incorporate the divine component. They sound, well, celestial, important.
And Yeshua doesn't have that L ending.
No, it doesn't. And beyond that, there's just a profound lack of evidence. You search the pre-Christian Jewish texts, the Hebrew Bible, the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha, the extensive Dead Sea Scrolls library, there is simply nothing that attests to an angel or any significant celestial intermediary bearing the name Yeshua. It's just not there.
But the name Yeshua was common among humans at the time, wasn't it?
Oh, incredibly common. That's the flip side of the coin. Far from being a unique celestial name, Jesus Yeshua, which means Yahweh saves or Yahweh helps, was one of the most popular, maybe top 5 male names in Second Temple Judaism. Bart Ehrman notes it was borne by dozens of verifiable historical figures we know about from texts. People like Jesus ben Sirach, who wrote the book of Sirach or Ecclesiasticus, or Jesus ben Ananias, a rather eccentric prophet mentioned by Josephus who prophesied Jerusalem's doom before the Roman War. The sheer ordinariness, the commonness of the name Yeshua, weighs heavily against the proposition that it originated as the unique, majestic title of a pre-existing heavenly archangel.
Yeah, it seems if you're trying to invent a unique, powerful, pre-existing cosmic being, you'd probably give him a unique, impressive, celestial-sounding name. You likely wouldn't pick the first-century equivalent of, I don't know, John or Steve or Mike.
Exactly. The very simplicity and commonness of the name argues more naturally for a simple historical origin it belonged to a man. Furthermore, stepping beyond the name, the core concept of a crucified celestial being is just completely absent from known Jewish thought of the period. Angels in Jewish literature served various roles. They were messengers, mediators, warriors, heavenly scribes, but they were never depicted as executed redeemers who die, let alone die by crucifixion. Simon Gathercole stresses this point. Carrier's archangel theory is essentially a speculative reconstruction. It lacks any real textual foundations within the actual religious landscape of first-century Judaism. You can't point to a text that supports it.
So, again, we seem to encounter that fundamental methodological principle that historians always try to rely on, the principle of economy or simplicity.
We certainly do. Occam's razor, basically. The simplest explanation, the one that fits the available evidence with the fewest added assumptions, is generally preferred. In this case, the simplest explanation supported by multiple independent sources, Paul, Josephus, Tacitus, the Gospels, is that the name Jesus belonged to an actual human teacher who was executed. Mythicism, particularly this archangel version, violates that principle of economy. It requires inventing complex, hypothetical entities like a pre-Christian archangel named Jesus, who undergoes a cosmic crucifixion for which there is zero precedent or attestation in the massive body of Second Temple Jewish literature we actually possess.
So why multiply these hypothetical entities unnecessarily when a single, historically plausible figure, a human man, fits the known facts much more straightforwardly?
That's the core methodological objection. #TagV, methodological flaws in mythicism.
Okay, so beyond these specific disputes over texts like Paul or the existence of archangels, it seems the entire mythicist thesis really falters because of deeper issues with its analytical methods. This isn't just a disagreement over translating a word here or there. It seems to be a fundamental disagreement over how history itself should be done.
That's a fair assessment, and we really can't discuss Richard Carrier's work, which is central to modern mythicism, without dissecting his primary research tools. Let's start with his use of the myth pattern.
Right. Carrier uses something called the Rank-Raglan hero pattern. This was originally developed by scholars like Otto Rank and Lord Raglan, who were studying folklore and mythology, not necessarily history. Carrier applies this pattern to Jesus, arguing that Jesus fits the profile of a mythical hero alongside figures like Oedipus, Romulus, or Hercules, suggesting he was likely created from these common popular motifs rather than being a historical figure.
Yes, but using this folkloric pattern for historical study is highly problematic, and critics point out several major issues. Firstly, the typology itself, even within folklore studies, has been criticized for being quite vague and flexible. How you define each point can really change the score. The pattern has about 22 criteria, sort of fixed points relating to the hero's birth, childhood, mission, death, and aftermath. Examples include things like the hero is born of a royal mother, the circumstances of his conception are unusual. He faces attempts on his life as an infant. He eventually meets an ignoble death. His body is often missing, and so on.
Okay, so applying that pattern, which criteria does Jesus actually fit, especially if we're disciplined and only use the very earliest sources, like Paul's undisputed letters, before the potentially more legendary Gospels were written?
Well, that's the key. When you apply the Rank-Raglan criteria strictly, and only to what we can glean from Paul's earliest letters, Jesus only satisfies maybe 4 or perhaps 5 of the 22 points. He gets points for things like, arguably, having a noble mother, if descended from David implies nobility, maybe being born under the law fits unusual birth circumstances in a broad sense, and he certainly had an ignoble death. But he immediately fails on core criteria like having a king for a father, Joseph wasn't a king, marrying royalty, having his childhood spent abroad, ruling a kingdom, etc. Paul tells us almost nothing about those things.
And this is where Daniel Galata points out a potential flaw in Carrier's application of the pattern, isn't it? That he modifies the criteria.
Yes, exactly. Golda argues that Carrier adjusts the scoring system, sometimes significantly, to achieve the desired outcome. For example, one criterion in the original pattern demands the hero's father is a king. Since Joseph clearly wasn't a king, Carrier apparently expands the criterion to allow father is a king or heir of a king to give Jesus the point based on the later gospel genealogies linking Joseph to David's line. But that expansion feels like a classic case of, well, intellectual goalpost moving. It allows him to boost Jesus' score artificially by changing the rules, which undermines the supposed objectivity of the whole exercise.
So the system itself is being stretched and manipulated, potentially, to reach the predetermined conclusion that Jesus looks mythical, according to this pattern.
That's the criticism. But there's a final and perhaps even more critical critique of using this pattern for historicity. Even if Jesus did score perfectly on the Rank-Raglan scale, what would that actually prove about whether he existed?
Yeah, that's the fundamental point. It doesn't actually disprove historicity at all, does it?
Not in the slightest. Bart Ehrman constantly reminds us of this key distinction. Mythologization is not the same thing as myth. Real, confirmed historical figures, people like Alexander the Great, Augustus Caesar, even George Washington to some extent, all accumulated legendary motifs, miracle stories, and heroic traits over time as their legends grew. People naturally ascribe greatness, unusual origins, and symbolic significance to influential founders or heroes. Fitting a mythic pattern might just mean a historical person became heavily mythologized after their life. Carrier seems to confuse this later legendary embellishment that may have happened with the fundamental question of existence itself.
Okay, let's pivot then to his other primary tool, Bayesian reasoning. Now, this sounds incredibly rigorous, maybe even objective, because it involves mathematics applied to history. How can math be flawed?
Well, Bayesian reasoning itself, as a statistical method, is perfectly valid within its domain, like calculating probabilities in science or computing. The issue arises when you try to apply it to complex, unique historical events where the inputs are inherently subjective. Bayesian analysis depends entirely on the input values, particularly something called the prior probability you assign to a claim before you even look at the specific evidence. It's essentially a closed-loop system where your initial assumptions heavily influence the final calculated probability.
Can you explain what a prior probability is in this specific context? Like, how would Carrier use it?
Sure. A prior probability is basically the initial guess or bias you assign to a proposition before examining the evidence, like Paul or Tacitus. So if Carrier, for instance, decides beforehand to assign a very low prior probability, let's say, just hypothetically, a 1 in 1,000 chance that a historical man named Jesus who founded Christianity actually existed, then the mathematical formula, even when fed the evidence from Paul or Tacitus, will inevitably be skewed by that initial low probability. The math will almost certainly push his final calculated probability towards the mythicist conclusion he started with.
So the apparent objectivity is potentially compromised, because the subjective input, the initial guess, heavily determines the output. The rigorous-looking mathematics might just end up validating a preset bias.
That's precisely the critique Galata and others make. It creates an illusion of scientific or mathematical rigor, but without genuine historical validation, because the result is baked in from the start. History requires careful weighing of evidence, understanding context, assessing source reliability, things that are hard to reduce to simple probability numbers. Applying Bayesian models to these deeply contested historical questions can often just serve to confirm the researcher's existing hypothesis under a veneer of math.
And that leads us to the final methodological critique, which seems quite significant. Selective skepticism. This feels like a potential double standard in how evidence is treated.
Yes, this is perhaps the most glaring methodological flaw pointed out by critics like Gather-Cole and Ehrman. A historian must strive to be consistent in their application of skepticism. Carrier and other mythicists tend to dismiss the external, historically grounded sources like the references in Josephus and Tacitus very quickly. They might label them as unreliable, late, interpolated, based purely on Christian hearsay, or somehow fundamentally flawed. They treat these sources with maximum suspicion.
Okay, so high skepticism towards existing historical texts, but simultaneously, they build their positive case, their alternative theory, on entirely hypothetical constructs.
Exactly. The positive case for mythicism often relies heavily on inventing things like the pre-Christian archangel named Jesus, or the purely cosmic crucifixion complex scenarios and entities for which, as we discussed, there is effectively zero direct textual or archaeological evidence from the period. Gather-Cole critiques this strongly as a massive double standard. You have extreme skepticism applied to existing, grounded testimony, even if imperfect, while simultaneously having extreme credulity towards purely hypothetical constructs invented to make the theory work. If you demand absolute, ironclad, non-circular proof to accept even a mention in Tacitus, surely you must apply an even higher standard before accepting the existence of an entirely unattested archangel.
It seems inconsistent, methodologically. You can't dismiss existing evidence lightly while inventing new evidence freely.
It undermines the claim to a purely rational, evidence-based approach. #tag6. Independent external attestation from Roman and Jewish sources.
Okay, let's circle back for a moment and really underscore the crucial importance of these non-Christian sources, because it's worth repeating. Even if, hypothetically, all of Paul's letters were suddenly lost to history, we would still have strong external reinforcement for the historicist position. And crucially, these aren't Christians trying to prove their own faith. These are often neutral or even hostile writers just documenting a social phenomenon they observed.
Absolutely. Let's look again maybe a bit more closely at Tacitus, the Roman historian. Writing around 116 CE, Tacitus was chronicling the reign of Emperor Nero. His history, the Annals, specifically Book 15, Chapter 44, is so crucial because it gives us a window into Roman bureaucratic knowledge, or at least common upper-class Roman understanding, about the origin of this Christian movement decades earlier.
Tell us again why his testimony is considered so valuable by historians. Beyond just confirming the name Christus, what makes it carry weight?
Well, as we mentioned, his value is partly in his open bias against Christians. Tacitus clearly despised them. He calls them practitioners of a deadly superstition and accuses them of hatred against mankind. He's not trying to do them any favors, so if he hated them, he had absolutely no motive to somehow legitimize their founder or invent a historical basis for their movement if there wasn't one commonly understood. His statement that Christus, from whom the name Christian had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty executed during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, that isn't presented as theology or belief. It's presented as a simple matter of administrative fact, explaining the origin of the name of this group. Nero was scapegoating. Galata and others stress that this report most likely derives either from official Roman records, which meticulously documented executions of provincial troublemakers, or, at the very least, from common knowledge circulating among the educated elite in Rome regarding the origins of this notorious foreign superstition.
So it firmly anchors Jesus' execution within the actual structure and timeline of Roman imperial administration. It makes the execution a specific, verifiable type of historical act, attested by the political and cultural enemies of the movement itself.
The cumulative weight there is really undeniable. You have a non-Christian, politically astute, hostile historian attributing the origin of the Christian movement directly to the execution of its founder by a specific named Roman official within a specific time frame in the first half of the first century. That's powerful external data.
Okay, then next we revisit Josephus, the Jewish historian. We already discussed his crucial reference to James, but let's look again at the broader implications of how he makes that reference.
Right. Writing in the 90s CE, Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, 20.20, describes the political maneuvering that led to the illegal stoning of James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ.
And the key significance here isn't just that he mentions Jesus, but the tone or the manner in which he does it.
Absolutely. It's the casual, almost incidental manner of the reference that is highly significant. Josephus doesn't stop to introduce Jesus. He doesn't say, James, the brother of a certain Jesus, a figure some called the Christ, who people claim did miracles. None of that. He simply uses Jesus, who is called Christ, as the known point of identification for James. The implication is that Josephus presumed his intended audience, educated Romans and Jews reading his history, already knew who this Jesus was. James is identified by his relationship to the more famous Jesus.
So, if Jesus had been just a purely celestial myth, known only through obscure visions within a fringe group, Josephus likely would have had to elaborate significantly on who this Christ figure was supposed to be. The fact that he doesn't suggest Jesus was already a known historical reference point.
Exactly. John P. Meyer, a prominent scholar on the historical Jesus, notes this passage stands as strong, independent testimony that Jesus was remembered, even outside Christian circles by the 90s CE, as the movement's recognized founder. A figure whom any reasonably educated audience in that part of the world would immediately recognize, at least by name and association.
That strongly suggests that public historical knowledge about Jesus, or at least about the claims surrounding him, was already fairly widespread by the time Josephus wrote his history. It wasn't some hidden internal secret.
It certainly seems that way. And finally, just to round out the picture, we should briefly look at some internal Christian disputes from the early 2nd century. These actually further solidify the baseline belief in an earthly, historical Jesus among early Christians themselves. Around 110 CE, so not long after Josephus and Tacitus, we have letters from Ignatius, who was the bishop of Antioch. He wrote these letters while being transported to Rome for martyrdom. In them, he polemicizes, he argues very strongly, against certain groups he considered heretics. These heretics became known as Docetists. Docetism comes from the Greek word dakio, meaning to seem or to appear. Their belief was that Jesus only seemed or appeared to have a real physical body. They denied he truly came in the flesh, suffered physically, or died physically.
Okay, wait. So if Docetism, the idea that Jesus wasn't truly physical, was being condemned as a heresy around 110 CE, what does that tell us about the mainstream Orthodox view they were arguing against?
It tells us that the mainstream conviction, the view Ignatius was vigorously defending as the authentic tradition, was precisely the opposite. That Jesus had lived, suffered, and died in the flesh, physically and historically. As Gathercole and others point out, if mythicism, the belief in a purely celestial, non-physical, non-historical Jesus, had actually been the original standard belief within the early church, then the emergence of Docetism as a heresy would make absolutely no sense. Why condemn people for believing Jesus only seemed physical if the original belief was that he wasn't physical at all?
It would be condemning them for being too close to the original view.
Exactly. Docetism only makes sense as a heretical departure from an already established, widely held historical conviction that Jesus of Nazareth was a real human being who had a real physical body, really suffered, and really died on a cross. The very existence of this fierce early 2nd century debate presupposes that the foundational conviction of the mainstream church was historicity.
So let's try to synthesize all of this material for you now. What have we seen? The mythicist hypothesis, while it's certainly rhetorically bold, and it definitely has found popularity in some online venues, it really struggles immensely when it's confronted directly with the actual historical evidence. It seems to require straining the textual evidence we have, forcing these highly convoluted, non-obvious metaphorical readings onto Paul's pretty clear descriptions of Jesus' biological birth, born of a woman, and his specific Jewish lineage, descended from David according to the flesh.
Yes. And it also requires dismissing crucial, independent, and often hostile external attestation. Sources like Josephus, the Jewish historian, and Tacitus, the Roman historian, whose testimonies, despite their own biases, firmly anchor Jesus' life, family connections, and especially his death by crucifixion within the verifiable historical and political context of 1st century Roman Judea.
And then there are the methodological issues we discussed. Mythicism seems to rely on methods that potentially compromise their own claims to rigor. They tend to multiply hypothetical entities like the unattested pre-Christian archangel named Jesus entities for which there is effectively zero direct textual or archaeological support.
Right, while at the same time employing analytical tools like Bayesian reasoning in ways where subjective inputs, the initial probability assignments, can heavily predetermine the outcome, creating perhaps an illusion of objectivity rather than a demonstration of it. And the selective skepticism, applying different standards to existing evidence versus invented hypotheses, is also a major concern.
So the conclusion reached by the overwhelming mainstream of critical scholarship across various beliefs and backgrounds remains the simplest, the most historically responsible, and the most economical explanation of the data we possess. Jesus of Nazareth was a first-century Jewish teacher who gathered followers and was crucified under the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate.
Mythicism, in the end, seems to substitute elaborate conjecture and special pleading for careful historical analysis. And based on the current evidence, it simply cannot overturn this firmly established consensus. The persistence of mythicism in popular culture probably reflects the enduring allure of radical skepticism, and perhaps the complexities of the sources themselves, more than it reflects the actual strength of its historical case.
Which brings us back, maybe full circle, to that powerful point about the crucifixion, the criterion of embarrassment. We've established throughout this discussion that arguably the most certain bedrock historical fact about Jesus is his humiliating execution by the Romans, this political and social disaster that paradoxically had to happen historically to ground the subsequent story.
So here's the final thought we want to leave you with, something for you to mull over. If the execution, the scandalon, the shame, the political failure, is the one historically necessary fact that almost everyone, including critics, agrees likely happened, how does the historical necessity of that utterly shameful, inconvenient event influence how we should understand the relationship between what we call historical truth and what later became spiritual claims about Jesus?
Does the very shamefulness inherent in the foundational fact of the crucifixion make the later grander claims about Jesus' divine identity more historically plausible because they had to overcome such a scandalous beginning? Or perhaps less plausible because they seem like such a desperate attempt to redeem that initial failure?
How does the embarrassing historical core shape the way we even think about evidence, belief, and the construction of meaning in history?
That's a question for you to explore as you continue your own deep dive into history and its enduring, fascinating mysteries. Thanks for joining us.